Okay, so the Ersatz Yorck class, rather like the Ersatz Monarch class, just means they are going to be New Yorks, the replacements of the Yorck class. Although, to be fair, they were going to actually replace more than the Yorks. They were going to replace 3 ships. And how do I put this politely? Yeah, there was no chance they were ever actually going to be finished. It's kind of like the admirals in World War I, in that the British build them, but they keep learning new stuff, so they keep changing the ideas of what they're going to build. And Hood only gets finished because they decide they're going to at least finish one of them. There is a good argument to make about learning through war and how that changes things, and whether or not you pause construction. Normally you finish off the construction you were doing, but starting actual new construction, that is usually put off till you've had a chance to learn the lessons. That's the strange thing the British do. Well, Jackie Fisher does, because of course he is obsessed with speed as armour, and basically cancels about 3R class and the 6th Queen Elizabeth class HMS Agincourt, so 4 battleships, to get 2 full-sized battle cruisers. We're going to call them the Renowns, and they actually have a meaning in this particular video, so it's worthwhile considering them. And Courageous, Glorious, and Furious. The 3 half-decent aircraft carriers. I'm going to say they are half-decent to decent aircraft carriers when they were converted, but they certainly proved useful. But let's be honest, as warships go, the large light cruisers, aka battle cruisers on even weirder diets, were really not the greatest designs known to mankind. In fact, frankly, they were a good example of why you shouldn't give someone who has, again, putting this politely, come back from retirement after successfully orchestrating what is basically a political coup against one of their successors to achieve it, using the national feelings at the time, the complete keys to the kingdom when it comes to construction. The fact he was able to get round all the blocks and all the controls in the system as well as he was comes down to not only Fisher himself having the connections he does have and having had the power he had in the Royal Navy for the time he had, but also comes down to the fact that basically government just was overawed by him, and the First Lord of the Admiralty, aka the Lord, aka Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, was absolutely in awe of him. It happens. But the thing is, that all takes place, and as a result, the Renowns are ordered. And the Renowns are built. And some absolute bright spark in the German Navy decides that what they need to do is continue with the orders they've had since roughly 1912, in terms of the 1912 Navy law, and replace the Yorck and the 2 Scharnhorst class cruisers with new battle cruisers. And these were going to be improved Mackinsons, basically. Now, of course, the Mackinson class also never gets finished. Never gets finished. So, this is a running theme going on here. The Germans have a lot of big plans. They have a lot of investment. And they don't actually finish things. You could argue it would have been more sensible to maybe, instead of ordering the Ersatz Yorck, to focus their energies into completing the Mackensons. After all, the Mackensons would have provided them with 4 28-knot battle cruisers of the, well, the German style, basically. The Mackensons are fun ships to look at. They'd had 13.8-inch guns and AK 350mm. And it's just always fun when you look at the prevailing time, they're working things out in inches, but some nations are working them out in millimeters, and so it leads to some really, really odd figures in inches. And you're sort of going, why didn't they just go for a 14-inch gun? Why go for a 13.8? Because it's 350mm. And it's a fun thing. But the Yorks, well, basically, they're Mackensons whose speed has dropped to 27.3 knots, but who are now armed with 15-inch guns. That was the plan. This would not have been good. But we'll get into that. Shameless book plug. I am very fortunate, I will always admit, in having a YouTube channel, in having your support, because as an academic, it's been incredibly freeing. How do I mean? I have a source of historical income, of money, of finance coming in from history, to fund other historical research, to fund things like, actually also to fund my snack and iron brew budget, but we'll leave that to one side. It's good. It keeps me going when I'm working out here. It allows me to keep going. It allows me to do all that stuff and to buy pictures for next book, which is I'm working on, and to do all those things without having to constantly fill out grant forms. Although I still do grant applications, but I now focus in on grants which I'm like have a better chance of getting. And it allows me to an extent, be independent of the grant process, in that whereas most grants these days, especially in history, come with strings, either declared or implicit, in terms of how they want you to present the information, how they want you to go about your work. History is supposed to be a pursuit of the historical facts, the truth, to find out the information that's needed to be known, so we can better inform ourselves of the past, and therefore hopefully better prepare ourselves and better inform our decisions in the future. You don't do that. You don't get good quality historical research if you go into that research with either a preformed opinion or a preformed methodology. You need to pick the methodology which fits the information that you're getting in order to examine the historical records accurately. And you need to go in with an open mind, so you follow the information. I'm always telling my students to read history forward. Don't read it backwards. Don't read it as you know where it goes. Read it from the beginning and see where it could have gone, and then see why it went where it did. You can't do that as freely if you have strings. So thank you. And let's just quickly restart this so you don't lose any time with the Ersatz Yorks. So, Yorck was a Rune-class armoured cruiser, and believe it or not, the Germans had slowly, the Kaiserlich Marine had slowly been working through replacing their armoured cruisers with battle cruisers. You can understand why. It's the going trend, and of course this is why a lot of people do presume armour cruisers turn into battle cruisers, but to an extent I would say armour cruisers divide off into what could have been in terms of a heavy cruiser and the battle cruiser, because the battle cruiser starts getting into the capital ship races, and that's why you see their tonnage going up, and they start getting very big, and they're associated with the dreadnoughts, and the capital ships are going bigger and bigger and bigger, and which means that a lot of cruising roles which the armour cruisers had done were either filled by armour cruisers which were still in service, as they were in the Royal Navy, or were left undone, or it was very inefficiently done by a battle cruiser. Because let's be honest, theoretically, the Ersatz Yorks, if you're replacing the Scharnhorst, 2 of them should have been sitting out, it should have been completed and should eventually be sitting out in the China Station, an East Asia Squadron. But they'd have been your newest, most powerful battle cruisers. And they'd have been stuck the other side of the world, far away from home, far away from maintenance, far away from support, and likely to be, well, in any war, let's be honest, what happened to von Spey's squadron at Cornell was a victory, and the Falkland Islands was inevitable. The odds of them successfully getting home were never in their favour. But saying that, the Yorck, the Scharnhorst, they had been good vessels. They had served the German Navy well. They had provided them with presence around the world. And as you can see, they're not, for their time period, they're not inelegant. They are commensurately well armed, commensurately well armoured. You can see the whole, where the armoured belt is. You can see where the accommodation is. It's a very illustrative design. And the plan was to replace this vessel, which itself had been lost to mines in 1914. Actually sunk by German mines in November 1914. In a recent video about issues from World War I and World War II, I brought up the whole mine-laying submarine thing, and the whole mine-laying effectiveness of submarines. And someone response to it was that mine-laying off America was, well, there were 2 responses. One was the very interesting one, of course, the intercoastal canalways and routes, and you can't really get mines into there, and they are right to an extent. You can, but it's not going to be easy. It would require small boat crews or various other systems for getting the mines into there. You don't really want to do that. But the other response was, well, what about the American minefields? Surely that would make things more complicated. Well, the thing is, when you make a minefield, you make it have a channel through, usually, for you to get in and out. You don't cover the whole area. So that means you have a safe zone. Now, you have to sweep that daily anyway to deal with your own mines going into there. But if someone else is laying mines in them, that makes life even more difficult. And that's the whole thing for the loss of the Yorck. It's always listed, it's always presumed, it was a German mine. However, there are some interesting things of British submarines going around at the point, including some which were doing some mine laying in a not too dissimilar area. So there is always the possibility that one of the British mines actually managed to go bobbing about where it wasn't supposed to. It's very unlikely, but it's not an impossibility. But the point is, mines are a double-edged sword, and they can quite easily hurt you. Now, what is interesting is we're talking about the replacement of this ship. She was launched in 1904, commissioned in 1905. She is part of the second naval law of 1900, and yet her replacement, even if she hadn't been lost, her replacement was going to be the Yorck class, the Ersatz Yorck class, which were planned to be built between 1915 and 1918. They were going to be launched. They were commenced in 1916 under the 1912 naval law. This shows you the pace of change. The Scharnhorst class, well, Scharnhorst and Eisenhower were launched in 1906, and they're going to be replaced as well. She had a top speed of 20.4 knots. She was armed with 4 210mm, that's 8.3-inch guns. 10 150mm, aka 5.9-inch guns. Just make it 152 and it becomes a 6-inch. It's just, you know. And 14 88mm guns. Again, watch the Germans. If they start building an 88mm gun in any variety, that usually suggests a war is coming. Okay, I do not know what it is, but the 88mm is the German sweet spot. So if you hear the Germans are working on an 88mm gun of any shape or form, start investing in some sort of, you know, nice protective space for your family. Every war, every time they're in a war, an 88mm comes out. It's just something with the Germans and the 88mm. It's like the British and the 105, okay? To be fair, 4.5-inch, 4-inch, 4.7-inch, if those start coming out in British, you worry. The Americans don't have a specific gun. Not that I can think of. If anyone does have an idea, and this is not today's question, but if anyone does have an idea of what specific gun, you watch out, because if the Americans start building it, that means war is coming. I'd love to hear. It could arguably be the 8-inch gun, but I don't think so. Now, they'd been good ships. They'd served them well, but they wanted to replace them. And as they're looking at replacing them, well, as I already mentioned, these come in. Because originally, they were just going to be 3 more Mackinsons. But then the Renowns came in. Don't they look pretty? Well, in this case, HMS Renown, doesn't she look pretty? 6 15-inch guns. HMS Renown is one powerful vessel. Top speed of 32 knots though. So you have automatically got a problem. Now, normally at this point I would say, well, with a battlecruiser and a battleship, if the battlecruiser wants to engage, it has a choice. It can either run away from the battleship anytime it wants to, but if it engages, it's in the range of its guns, and on the battleship's guns, because they're probably going to have similar ranges, in which case the battleship's armor wins. True, but you have 2 battlecruisers here, and one is having a speed of 27.3 knots. The other one has a speed of 32 knots, and that's again if we trust the British on the speed limit of their ships. As we've been over before, there are several reasons you do not trust the Royal Navy on things like declared speed limits. Our ship honestly can do a maximum speed of X. The report from the opposition navy, when they're being chased by them, it didn't stop until it was going X plus. So always use speed, maximum speed, as sort of a guiding principle. There's usually ways. For most navies, there is the case of telling the chiefs to disregard the safeties and push the boilers to everything you can get. Some navies lie completely. And when I say lie completely, I mean they have the maximum normal operating speed, which they will normally do in peacetime. And then in wartime, oh, well, if I just happen to click that, oh, we seem to have more steam going into the boiler. We seem to have upped the water pressure. Oh, and we seem to have upped the burn rate. Yes, we're getting fuel through fuel far faster. It's far less efficient. But we appear to be going about 4 knots faster. Oh my, I wonder how that happened. Safety margins. Anytime someone goes, well, surely isn't this boiler built up more than it needs to be for what you require of it? You just go, well, no, we've got to have safety margins. Safety margins. Do you realise what we're containing in there? It's a safety margin. Yeah. Anyway. The Renown class. When Jackie Fisher guts 3 R-class battleships to build 2 battlecruisers, and also free up a load of turrets and monitors. Well, that's what he uses as an excuse anyway. He uses the turrets and monitors. Why do these justify Renown? Why do these justify redesign? They're 15-inch guns. They are powerful. And yes, they come into service after the Battle of Jutland. But that's probably a good thing. Because they're 15-inch guns, and if they'd managed to be in service, then more of the 15-inch gun battleships would probably have been in service at Jutland, and frankly, those ships caused a lot of damage. Most of the damage which seems to be done to the High Seas Fleet was caused by the 15-inch guns. Mainly because, of course, the British had problems with their shells, and which led to a whole video about what would happen at Jutland if the Royal Navy had Green Boy style shells, i.e. shells which actually detonated and didn't have all the issues they had when fired at Jutland. But still, a 15-inch shell is still a lot of kinetic energy hitting you, even if it does go weird. So, compared to the Renowns, this is their benchmark, this is what they're being built to deal with. Well, their normal displacement, roughly 33,500 tons, which means they are 5,900 tons. Yes, 5,900 tons heavier than the Renowns. They are shorter than the Renowns, who are 242 meters overall length, and these were 227 meters. They were beamier than the Renowns at 30.4 to 27.5, and length to beam ratio does affect your speed. And their draft was deeper than the Renowns at 9.3 to 8.2 meters. So these are chunky ships. And again, you have the reality that for the Germans, there's always not the option of building what you consider a pure battlecruiser or something purely on the battlecruiser role. They've always got to consider the fact that these ships have got to back up their battleships, because they do not have enough battleships alone to take on the ground fleet. So the battlecruisers always have to be a sort of second line. It's a similar policy as the Japanese, as I've discussed before in several other videos. The reality of German battlecruiser design is they've always got to build something slightly heavier, because there is always a good chance that these vessels will end up supporting the battle line, or possibly even in the battle line in dire circumstances. That's actually what happens at Jutland. Now, they had 32 boilers, supplying 4 geared steam turbines to drive 4 shafts with 90,000 metric horsepower. That's 89,000 shaft horsepower. This is compared, of course, to the 42 boilers on the Renowns, which drove 2 geared steam turbine sets that supplied 4 shafts with 112,000 shaft horsepower. So in order to get those extra, what can I say, 4.7 knots from the Renowns, you have to have 23,000 more shaft horsepower. You have to have a greater length to beam ratio, i.e. both longer and narrower hull, and to do all that you need to be carrying an extra 10 boilers. Now, they had a range of 5,500 nautical miles at 14 knots, and this compares with the 4,000 nautical miles at 18 knots of the Renowns fairly decently. But let's be honest, cruising speed of 18 knots versus 14 knots, probably they both average out at about the same fuel and range at the same similar speeds. It won't be too much differential. There's also the fact that the German vessel, probably because it's carrying 8 rather than 6 15-inch guns, requires 1,227 crew to the 953 of the Renown. So, you know, small difference going on there. Small difference. About 274. Roughly, give or take. And as mentioned, they do have an advantage. They do have an extra pair of 15-inch guns. They have 12 5.9-inch, that's 150 millimeters, in casemates. The Renowns have no casemates. They have 8 88 millimeters, that's 3.5-inch, in single mounts. The Renowns have 19 4-inch guns in 5 triple and 2 single. Plus they have 2 single. And then the Ersatz Yorks were going to have 3 600mm, that's 24-inch torpedo tubes, to the Renowns 2 21-inch 533mm torpedo tubes. Now, here is the point at which you start to see, one is the battle cruiser of the British construction versus the, in a way, vessel which is supposed to be in the second line. So, the Germans were always edging closer towards the fast battleship paradigm, and the British were always building towards battle cruisers. And this is the interesting thing that comes about. It's what leads to a lot of differential analysis with them. When you start to realize what the Germans were building at, their differences make sense, but also you sort of go, well, hang on, why didn't they couldn't build a fast battleship, so they're building a battle cruiser which is not really a good battleship for the battleship role and not fast enough for the battle cruiser role. And that's why at that point I often go, well, the German battle cruisers make the least sense, because what they want them to do versus what they can and how they're building them to try and fulfill those roles means that they're always going to be at a disadvantage. You do not want to be in one of these ships because, let's be honest, if you were in an Ersatz Yorck as strong as it is, 11.8 inch main belt and certain critical areas, by no means got the same coverage as a battleship. Deck, lovely. Turrets, lovely. All that protection. Secondary battery, all those protections, great. Nowhere near the coverage or protection of a battleship's armour. So it really doesn't want to be fighting that. And now it's too slow to dictate the fight with a battlecruiser. With a 4.7 knot advantage. Renowns, as far as they're concerned, these things, they've got a 4 knot advantage over the Mackinsons. They can not only decide when they fight them, they can avoid them if they don't want to fight them, and just dance around them, if they're being handled properly. But there again, the Renowns have an armour belt which is between 3 and 6 inches. So, broadly speaking, it starts off at roughly similar levels. Let's be honest, it's 3.9 inches. It's 24 millimeters between friends. But 152 versus 300 millimeters of armor. Deck armor is between 1 and 2.5 inches on the Renown versus 1.2 to 3.1 inches on the Ersatz Yorck. I suppose the sort of secondary battery would be the similar equivalent of the barbettes, and sort of in terms of what information we're getting at, because if you're looking at similar levels of importance, and that's between 4 and 7 inches on the Renowns. The gun turrets are between 7 and 9 inches of armor protection. So basically in every area other than the belt, the Ersatz Yorcks have more, but only a little bit. In terms of the armor belt, they have almost double over those critical areas. Now that again is an advantage. And honestly, if they can manage to get a Renown to go the same speed as them, match them, and try and pummel it out in a fight, they've got more armor, they've got 8 guns to the Renown's 6, they win. But Renown's job isn't to have a fight with the Ersatz Yorck. The Renown's job is to tell the battle fleet where the Ersatz Yorck is, and make sure it's led right into them, and then make sure it can't get away from them. Because if the Ersatz Yorck gets into close enough range with those ships, it might win the fight with the Renown, but it'll probably get damaged enough that the Queen Elizabeths, or whatever their successors are, coming up, goes, "Hello, we see you've hurt our friend. We want compensation now." It really does interest me sometimes to think what would have happened if the Germans had pursued a fast battleship route. Maybe not going for 28 knot ships, maybe pushing for 25 knot, 26 knot. A faster battle line than the Royal Navy had. Instead of going down the battlecruiser and battleship route, had just gone for trying to push their ships to 24, 25 knots. It could have given them a really powerful force. And the British would probably still been forced to go the battlecruiser and battleship route. But it would have meant that maybe the Germans could have ended up with a speed advantage over the ground fleet. But that would require infrastructure and would require a level of financial investment in terms of their fleet construction, which the Kaiserlich Marine always had trouble justifying in face of the army. It was a constant political battle. But that's where these ships really start to remind me, because when you of other ships, if you look around time, if you look at other fast battleship designs coming through at the time, these ships really start to look similar to them. And I would argue that the Ersatz Yorcks are a stepping stone on that path. I think they're still aiming too much to try and make them a battlecruiser for them to be a fast battleship. I would personally have thought it was more sensible for the Germans if they had maybe gone, right then, we are ignoring battlecruiser altogether and going fast battleship for this one, because to deal their competing aims, this is the problem. I'm not saying, and please note, I will never be calling them in terms of stupid or producing bad designs. They're not. But the trouble is Tirpitz versus Holzendorf, and this is something I've been looking into a lot recently because I'm doing a video about Holzendorf, which is going to come up after this comes out, but not too long after it. There is a constant debate between them. A constant debate. Over the Navy, over its design, over its structure. And honestly, Tirpitz is so busy trying to emulate the British in terms of a risk fleet. He never stops to sit down and go, do these ships make sense for us? Because for the British, churning out oodles and oodles of battleships makes sense for them. They need to protect a global empire. They're happy to do that. It's cheaper than fighting a war. Churning out battlecruisers that can race around the world and deal with commerce warfare, that makes sense to them. But what do the Germans need their battle fleet for? Well, if you're really building it up to fight the British, etc., and dominate them, and also you've got to dominate the Baltic, well, a fast battleship actually would make more sense, or trying to push for a fast battleship. If you're going to build a bigger, heavier ship anyway, might as well make it properly armoured. You won't be able to get a 28-knot ship on this technology and have the level of armour. But you could push for a 25-knot ship. Especially for small tube boilers, you can probably get to a 25-knot ship. 25-knot ship. And that would have been a significant advantage. But the Ersatz Yorcks are cool. If you're just looking at it as a pure piece of design and engineering, it's a very interesting design. And it's got some very interesting ideas going on in it. But I would also argue that it is very much still a spiritual successor of the Rune and the Scharnhorst armoured cruisers, especially once you consider the casemates, etc. And I would also argue that, as interesting a design as it is, both it and the Mackensons, and to be honest, all the battle cruisers the German Navy builds in the run-up to World War One and completes during World War One in some cases, they weren't what they needed. Nice ship though. Right, what have we got coming up? I forget what date this comes out on. This is the 4th of September. Oh goody. So it comes out on the Monday, and tomorrow it's going to be the land ships, and next week when this comes out, there is going to be Winning a War, Holzendorf and Unrestricted Submarine Warfare. If you're interested in Holzendorf, if you go and search him through my channel, you'll find him in the Access Chiefs of Staff videos. He's one of the ones I added in as a special at the end of the series to look at some of the World War I officers who shaped navies and what they became. He is a really, really interesting admiral and a really interesting character. Today's question. I've explained my thinking. I think better than pursuing battle cruisers, and I know they're replacing their armor cruisers, and I know they're given a budget for cruisers, but I think they could have gone for armored cruisers, but basically almost kept up with the Blucher sort of style of things, and gone on with those sort of large armored cruisers for their scout work, and put their efforts and their funds into making fast battleships. 25 knots. 24, 25 knots. I'd love to hear what you think. If the German Navy had pursued that, what do you think would have happened? The German Navy, by this point, I'm talking about the Kaiserliche Marine at this point. So the German Navy of prior to and during World War I. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed. Why has that done that?